This is probably the hardest thing to do, is overcome the shame that I think many parents carry around whatever they might perceive to be their own inadequacies, or whether they've had trauma in their past. There's so much shame and guilt in the parenting arena. So that's like a big part of the work initially, is just to acknowledge that and take away all the shame from it. There's no shame, because we're all wounded, aren't we? We're all carrying our own shape of wound. And I would say it's absolutely inevitable as a parent that you're carrying some shit that you're going to pass on to your kids.
Louis Weinstock, welcome, brother.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really glad to have you. Tate, welcome to you too as well.
Gentlemen, it's great to be with you.
Yeah. So let's just set up the foundation for today's episode. We are with someone actually I've known for many years now, Louis. I mean, how long ago has it been that we first connected?
I don't know. I'm going to say 10 years.
It might be 10 years.
I think so.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And so much has changed for you since. I mean, you have a daughter. So today on the podcast, we're talking about, in a way, parenting. Well, let me just introduce you, Louis. You're a child psychotherapist, a grief counselor, and the author of How the World is Making Our Children Mad and What to Do About It. You spent over 20 years helping children and families through some of life's toughest moments, whether it's loss, anxiety, or the overwhelming uncertainty of growing up in today's society. I mean, here's where I think, I'm not yet a father, God willing, that'll happen, but I am a man. And I think what I'm really excited to explore about in our conversation today is your take on, for children to truly thrive, fathers, and maybe just parents in general, but fathers, we've got to do our healing work ourselves first. Mm-hmm. Right? First, Louis, let me just start with this question. What does being a father mean to you? Not just personally, but like spiritually. What does it mean to you? And how old is your child? Do you just have one daughter?
I've got one daughter. She's 7 years old. And we also have had a whole series of losses along the way. So I feel like it's important to acknowledge that. Some, really difficult losses that were very late on in the pregnancy. So we're so blessed to have one daughter, but it just feels important, to honor the spirits that didn't quite make it here.
Well, I appreciate that, because my wife and I have been on a similar journey. We've shared this publicly. It's not a secret that, we learned 2 years ago that we can't have a child together. And that experience remains devastating. We even actually talked to a baby medium before we found out that news. And, I guess I probably shouldn't divulge what was shared there, just out of respect for my wife and her privacy. But I love that you're also a grief counselor, because I think on the journey of parenting, Tate, I wonder, you too, your own journey as a parent, having two kids that are now damn near teenagers, both of them. I mean, there's still so much grief. I think no matter how you come to being a parent, the road is filled, I would imagine, with just grief and loss and fear and chaos and all of that.
Yeah. And I think it's a particular challenge for men when you're going through a loss like that. So I remember the second time we had a late stage pregnancy loss. My wife got to 6.5 months, and then we found out that the baby heart was not beating. So had to go to hospital, found that out. And then I remember she got taken into a room to have a chat with a nurse, and I was sat in the waiting room on my own. It's quite a cold waiting room with that horrible fluorescent hospital lighting. I assume you probably have similar things in the States to how we do in the UK. Yeah. And it was just a horrible moment. And there was a guy with a laptop sitting opposite me who just kept looking up at me, and he was a bit sheepish. And then eventually he came over with this flyer, and it was a flyer. I think it was something like Dads Matter. And it was basically a support group for dads who go through these kinds of losses, or men who go through these kinds of losses. I never actually checked into that particular support because I just didn't get the vibe that I wanted to, I just didn't feel that was going to be helpful for me. But it was just that moment of contact when I was feeling like, really like, where's my support kind of thing? I mean, obviously it's brutally difficult for a woman to go through that physically, psychologically, and spiritually. But I just wanted to mention that, just to acknowledge this really tough for men to go through that as well.
Yeah. I think, especially for men, we tend to, contract around pain, around our losses. Just get over it. Okay, so it didn't work out. Fine. Let's get past it, on to whatever the next goal is, or the next problem to solve, the next task. And I mean, I'm a pretty thoughtful, open guy, and I can see that temptation in me too, to just all right, hunker down. Shit didn't work out. Let's fucking go. What do we have to do next? And oh man, the impact that has on my body, on my vitality, is it's not healthy. It's not good for me. It's not good for my marriage when I stay there.
The other thing that's important to mention is, I think men typically, and this is part of, I think, the archetype of masculinity, is we can kick into protector mode. So if you're in a shared experience of loss, but you're with a partner who's a female, I think it's easy then, and that definitely happened to me, to kick into protector mode. So what I had to do in the moment when we found out, I remember the first time that we went through this loss and we found out, I was really trying to stay strong for my wife. And eventually, after a few hours of going through this process, I went out of the hospital building and went for a walk like a mile around the corner. And I just cried the whole way. Cried. Got back to the hospital, went up in the lift, wiped my eyes, because I needed to get back into, carer and protector mode for my wife. And basically that idea of being the strong one, which I think is completely fine, by the way, but it's just important to acknowledge it, that that's just a role that we sometimes feel we have to occupy.
Yeah, no doubt. And it's an important role. It's not one to be overlooked or dismissed or minimized. And I think that when we men just get stuck in that role, like that is who I am. That's what I'm supposed to do. There's nothing else for me to express just other than protector. Again, it's like, I think in our work, Tate, you and I, one of the things that we're working to support men is becoming what I like to call like full range men, just men who have capacity of all kinds of ways of expressing ourselves. So, I'm curious, Louis, how then has your journey, the question that I asked you, like, what does being a father mean to you? Like, start us off there. I mean, it's one thing to imagine being a father, which is where I'm at, right? Imagining it, because I don't have a child yet. And I mean, there's so many questions that are lining up for this conversation, because, you wrote the book, How the World is Making Our Children Mad, and what to do about it. And as a prospective father, I'm also asking myself, do I even want to bring a child up in this world? Am I crazy to think that that's even a good idea? And so, again, I'm on this side of it. Both you and Tate are on the other side. You have children. You're in it. Yeah. There's only moving forward. So, what does being a father mean to you? How has that changed you? How has that, I don't know, shifted for you?
Well, I can remember the moment when my daughter was born, and my wife passed the baby to me. We did it was a hospital birth, but it was in like a little pool of water. So baby came out, my wife passed the baby to me, and I was holding the baby, this like fragile, vulnerable creature, on my chest. And because I'm trained as a psychotherapist, the only thing I could think of doing in that moment was I just like whispering to this little creature, going, "You are safe, you are safe, you are safe." Because I really just wanted to try and convey that energy that you're coming into a world where you're going to be safe. So that was kind of like obviously the first moment of what you could call like an awakening into the father, like protector father energy. And then about a year later, I was walking around London. We were living in London at the time. And I walked past these posters which had a skull and crossbones on and the words Extinction Rebellion. I don't know if you guys heard about that in the States, but basically we've had this huge movement in the UK called Extinction Rebellion, which is a climate protest movement that basically took over the streets of London. They did so many kind of radical, but also playful and loving acts of rebellion. It was a really great movement. I'd never heard of it. And I saw this poster and then I went home and looked it up. And then I started reading articles about just the deep sort of potential horrors and extinction that are coming our way that I was vaguely aware of before, but I hadn't really spent too much time really contemplating. But now that I was in the role of being a father, I was reading this and I just honestly felt a kind of terror really rising up in me because, you know, looking to the future, I was thinking, well, I'm going to be dead at some point soon, but I brought my daughter into this world and there's these predictions of apocalyptic scenarios and flooding and fires, all the stuff that we are seeing anyway, less so in the UK, although it's, you know, we're seeing it more now. So I just started to get really concerned, much more concerned than I was before. So I would probably explain in a way that the protector energy that we were talking about just got activated to an extra degree because I was a dad. And not even just for my daughter, really, but just extending that sort of concern to children who we're bringing into this world. And what can we actually do to try and make the world in the future a better possibility for them than what a lot of people are predicting.
Did you have that similar experience when your kids were born of like a switch flipping in you?
Yeah, I wish that I had a real clear memory. Sometimes there are these burning bush moments, and other times it's just like this gradual embodiment of fatherhood. And I think I had less of the burning bush and more of the gradual becoming for me. I think what's interesting about, I guess, my own journey in the world of fatherhood is the mistakes that I've made as father early on. And what I mean by that is when my daughter was born, when my son was born, all of my wife's energy went into nourishing, literally feeding and nourishing and caring for our kids. And not that I didn't have part of that role, but my wife breastfed for 18 months with both kids. And, you know, the toll of the energy that is on the mother, I think that part of my role as father, where I didn't show up in the ways that I needed to, was nurturing and taking care of my wife, who was spending all of her resources to nurture and take care of the baby. So part of my role as father was early on was to take care of my bride, and I didn't do that, not in the ways that I think really would have served her. But I too share your thought about this, Louis, which is my first role is protect. You know, I've thought about over the course of time, like there's 3 roles that I've had to evolve into as a father. Early on, it's that protector, right? I need to help my kids. You know, you put the corners on all the tables so that they don't bang their heads and cut their heads open. And you have to go through the house to make sure that the light sockets have all the protected things to go into the wall. And like, I took that role really seriously. But then as my daughter in particular, and then my son started to grow out of the role where they needed me to protect them all the time, I felt like my job was to move into preparing them for the world that they were going to face. How old is your daughter, Louis?
7.
7. Okay. So you're right at that place where less protection, still protecting a lot. Make sure you wear your helmet. Don't put your finger in the socket. Like, be careful, climbing the tree, whatever. And then I started shifting right about that age into my job is to prepare, like, the world that they're going to face, what they can experience and what they're going to go through. And then I had a devastating experience where no matter how much I tried to protect and prepare my daughter for the world that she was going to face, she met something that where she wasn't protected and where she wasn't prepared, which has really made me realize I still have those two roles, but my job as a father is really most important to be present for. Right. For whatever comes up, whatever they go through, whatever they experience, whatever they feel, whatever they think, to be present for that. And that's kind of my daughter's 14, my son's 11. I'm now in the stages of trying to figure out what's the right balance of those three things in each moment for each kid.
Yeah.
And Tate, I know that you have been on a profound healing journey especially over the last, I don't know, how many years would you say? Like, really, with your marriage, with, shifting how you show up and your presence. I mean, in the last
8 years.
Last 8 years. So,
yeah,
Louis, your work, a lot of your work, I think, focuses on parents and how we go on those healing journeys. Because Tate, if you didn't go on those healing journeys, you probably wouldn't be able to really be present at all.
No, and as I was thinking about your book, Louis, like how the world is making our children mad, it's almost like foundationally, it starts with the parents that if I didn't stop being mad in my own, unhealthy, ineffective, unhelpful ways, there was no way in the world that I could help my children meet a world that they were going to be faced with.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of what I say in the book, is that you as the parent are the primary filter through which your children experience the world. So it all begins with you. And, that's one of the things that used to concern me a lot in my work and in my practice was not just parents, but schools and the systems were just really pathologizing the children without acknowledging that actually the parents might be unconsciously and unknowingly just projecting their own traumas onto their kids. And this happens in subtle ways. Nobody's choosing to do it. So I just found actually where my work was often with children and young people initially, I then shifted my focus completely to working with parents, because I just thought that was going to be so much more effective. And it was. And one of the strange things, and I don't know if this will relate to your situation at all, Tate, but I've noticed it, and I know other people have noticed it, is very often when our children start having problematic experiences, and sometimes it's like random traumatic events that happen, it's very often at the same age that we experienced our own traumatic experiences that are somehow stuck and unresolved. And there's just this strange synchronicity between those ages and stages. And what happens often is that the children this stuff is coming up, whether it's symptoms or experiences, that is kind of, in a way, presenting the parent with an opportunity to heal, if that makes sense.
Well, even though I don't have a child, my parents divorced when I was 4, and that time in my life, I have a lot of memories of that time. And I mean, I remember there was even behavior that I was exhibiting that my parents were trying to figure out what's wrong with me at 4.
Yeah.
When, and I reflect back and look and go, well, damn, I mean, in retrospect, I realized I was just mirroring what was going on in my parents' disaster of a relationship.
Yeah.
I was expressing through my tiny little body. I was so constricted. Anyway, the thing that I find interesting is when I see a child that is 4 years old, I look at them with a particular regard. I'm like, okay, so that was me. when that happened.
Mm.
There's a part of me that's still trying to figure out or resolve something, or connect some gap, something. So I see that, even though I don't have my own child and I haven't lived through that by watching, but friends that have young children, I totally see that regard in myself, like, oh, interesting. That was me when all that happened.
Yeah.
And it's a fascinating, there is a developmental part of me, or a part of me that's sort of developmentally stuck as that little 4-year-old child that, whose parents were a mess and separated. And I mean, it was just ugly.
Yeah. I hear that.
So what does healing look like then? I mean, what, if I'm a parent listening to this, Louis, and it's like, okay, yeah. I mean, where do I even begin?
Yeah. Well, the first thing to do, and this is probably the hardest thing to do, is overcome the shame that I think many parents carry around their own, whatever they might perceive to be their own inadequacies, or whether they've had trauma in their past, and they're just, there's so much shame and guilt in the parenting arena. And in my work, that's kind of like the first thing, is just get parents to experience what it feels like to be another human being in a non-shaming, non-pathologizing space. And a lot of people don't have that space easily necessarily. Some of us are lucky to have that with our partners or friends or colleagues, but sometimes we might actually need to go and seek that out in other spaces, whether it's like peer support or therapy or whatever kind of healing modalities. But I really believe that is the first step, because basically if we carry too much shame and guilt, then what happens is the projection goes into the child, because we can't tolerate the feeling ourselves that there might be something inside of us that needs to be attended to first. So that's like a big part of the work initially, is just to acknowledge that and take away all the shame from it. Take away all the shame from it. There's no shame, because we're all wounded, aren't we? We're all carrying our own shape of wound. And I would say it's absolutely inevitable as a parent that you're carrying some shit that you're going to pass on to your kids. And there's no way of completely stopping that. As in, there's always going to be something that you're not resolved, because nobody's a perfectly resolved human being. But what we can do is just take care of ourselves in the day-to-day moments and interactions. And that's one of the things I've found the most helpful in my work with parents, is getting them to notice the specific trigger moments with their kids, and then giving them practices to work in those trigger moments. And often it's just very simple embodied stuff, kind of mindfulness stuff. So it's like taking a pause in the moment. And very often the trigger points are like repeated patterns. So it might be that when your child gets angry, that's a particular trigger for you as a dad. Or it might be the rush getting ready to get out the door for school, because it brings back memories of stuff that was happening when you grew up. Or it could be bringing up other stuff. So finding those trigger points and then working with the emotions really that are coming up in the body in those moments. And in a way, that's it really. For me, that's where the real change happens. Like I know in the States, like in the UK at the moment, there's such a huge interest in like transformational experiences. There's a huge interest in psychedelic therapies at the moment. And I see so many clients who've done these like deep transformational experiences, and they have these epiphanies and insights. And then they come back and they tell me all about it and say, my life's changed. I feel like I'm a changed person. And then the week later, they're like, oh, fuck.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I think in some ways we might just, it might feel a bit too mundane. Like even as I say, it might feel a bit too mundane, that the way I feel that healing happens is in that bringing that mindfulness into those day-to-day moments and interactions. But I do think that's the truth in my experience.
Well, I think one of the things you're pointing to, which is really, powerful, is, I love a good peak experience.
Me too.
Love those peak experiences, but the real work has to happen over time, that the peak experience can give you the momentum, a big burst of momentum, but it has to be then grounded into a longer term solution. And, one of the barriers that I think happens in particular for men, but I only say that because I know more about what it's like to be a man than a woman. But I think that one of the things that might hang parents up from wanting to go into the dark, right, and to do the deep work that's necessary, is the fear of there being some Pandora's box that they don't know how to close once they open it.
Yeah.
Right. It's like they're so afraid of what might be on the other side of that Pandora's box that it's just safer for them not to go into there. But I guess I'm curious to get your thoughts on, what do you think is really at stake if parents don't open Pandora's box? What's the implications of that, both for themselves and what do you know is going to happen to those kids if parents aren't willing to go to those dark places?
Good question. I mean, what is at stake is that your unresolved stuff will most likely get passed on to your kids, and then they'll have to deal with it when they become adults. So you're kind of just passing the buck down the road, and essentially, you're leaving your child with a potential legacy of more suffering than they need, really. That might sound harsh, but I think it's true.
Everyone needs a little bit of suffering.
Yes.
But to take on a lot, a lot of parents, again, innocently, unknowingly, I think of our parents' generation. Our parents didn't have YouTube. They didn't have, we're exposed to teachers, experts, for better or worse, but we're exposed to ideas that our parents never ever had access to, or if it came to them, it was if there were a tiny channel of a friend whispering or talking, or they saw something in the newspaper, or they saw a book at the library but they never picked it out, whatever, or they heard someone was doing therapy, but that's because their life was falling apart. You don't do therapy when things are just fine or okay, or there's so much like our parents didn't have, that generation didn't have everything that we have access to. And so I often look at our generation, of people our age, especially, Tate and I are in our 50s. How old are you, Louis?
45.
45, same age. I think in many ways we are the generation that is breaking the old patterns. At least we're the first generation that has the best shot at doing that, I would say. So
yeah.
Anyway, sorry, Louis, keep going.
No. I mean, I agree with all of that, and I just wanted to give a slightly more concrete example from my own work, and I can't give too many details, but a client that I worked with a while ago, where the parent had experienced a particular kind of abuse when she was growing up. And then her daughter had an experience which was so triggering for this parent that she just couldn't be present with her daughter because of that traumatic experience and because of her unresolved abuse. So she just couldn't be present for her daughter. And that meant that her daughter didn't feel like she could open up for ages about what happened to her and felt really alone. And the loneliness is one of the biggest factors that really turns an adverse experience into a trauma. So yeah, that's just to make it a little bit more concrete in terms of, a specific example of what can happen and the mechanics of how it can work.
Well, I really get to that you said earlier, we have this big idea, I think one of the big barriers to doing healing work is and not to say obviously there's truth to this, but that Pandora's box, there's this giant hole that I have to go into and get this whole underworld that I'm going to get sucked into. And again, to some degree that there may be truth to that. There could be a lot of past painful experience. I have friends that grew up in severely abusive homes, and oh my gosh, man. I mean, it is a kind of Hades that they're sitting on, this sort of underbelly of hell that is the source of a lot of rage and a lot of intensity and and these are my friends that are conscious of it, that are aware of it, that are able to talk about it, that can acknowledge it and hold it in a certain way. And how in the end, this kind of work only really matters insofar as we can just in the moment not act, like you said, when your child or your spouse, for that matter, or traffic, upsets you in some way. Trigger, the word we use right these days is triggers you. It just causes an emotional reaction. In the end, really what it comes down to is, can we meet that moment not from the old automatic response, which is just to get angry, or there's this beautiful quote by Krishnamurti that I read recently. True liberation is freedom from our automatic responses.
Yeah.
Right. Our automatic responses. So I really appreciate your perspective on that in the end, it just comes down to, how are we able to meet the moment? And if we're running away from the moment because we don't know how to meet it, or we don't want to meet it, or we're distracted, or we're okay, then that's let's just say that's a problem, right? And so, you talk about these triggers and these moments, and particularly the emotions that arise. That caught my ear as well, though, Louis, because what's the one thing that most men don't want to experience is emotions. So how do you work with a man to start helping him connect with and allow himself to even have emotions? Especially you Brits, man, you guys are like the OGs in emotional bypassing, right? Keep calm and carry on. Isn't that the national motto?
Yes, you're right. And it's a very good point. And it's I would say it's not easy in my experience, and it's quite like how to help a man, and even a British man, but any man, to sort of get more connected to his emotional self. For me, has been a sort of patient work. Like, you can't just force these things, in my experience. I think it helps to be in a group space where you see other men crying. So I remember, for example, this is going back, must be, my daughter was 2, so 5 years ago. I was at a festival in the UK, and I just decided to go to this singing workshop. And it turned out to be one of the most transformational experiences I've had, because the singing happened and everyone was singing in unison, this beautiful, like, just heart-opening song. And then slowly the teacher guided people to come and sit in the middle. So the people in the middle were surrounded by this singing. And then people on the outside put their hands on the people in the middle. The people in the middle started crying. And I was sort of 2 rows back from the middle, but I just started completely cracking open. And I wasn't going to a grief workshop. I was going to a singing workshop. And I remember afterwards, a guy who was sat just behind me came up to me and just said, "Thank you so much just for opening up." And I wasn't doing it on purpose to sort of say, I hope this lets other people cry. It just happened.
Of course.
But I do think there's just something about the safety created when you see other men expressing their emotions. But the one emotion that I really feel is the last kind of barrier for men, because I think we're getting much better at being in touch with our feelings. I think the last barrier is fear. And I've been thinking about this a lot recently, personally, because I feel fear often, and about a whole range of different things. And sometimes I don't even know why I'm feeling it. But how comfortable do I feel to share that experience of fear with other men? And I notice I'm much more comfortable crying in front of other men than sharing an experience of fear. I don't know if you guys can relate to that at all, or maybe you've evolved beyond that through your men's work. But
well, I think it's more opposite for me. It's easier for me to communicate a fear than it is to cry, or I can talk about sadness, but to
Right.
show sadness.
Right.
I even feel that sitting next to my wife. My wife loves it when I cry, but I can feel the part of me when we're watching a movie, or usually that's
Yeah.
when it happens. I can feel sadness welling up in me. I can immediately, and again, I'm aware of all this, but it doesn't stop the fear from being there. It's don't let that out. Don't show that. You can't reveal that.
Yeah.
So it's almost like the opposite for me, but it's still fear.
It's
right? It's
fear.
still
There's fear
fear.
there. Exactly. Yeah.
It's still fear guarding the sadness.
Yeah. What about you, Tate?
Yeah, I was trying to reflect on that. What I know for me, the easiest emotion for me to express is anger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And right, the adage that underneath anger there is another emotion that's driving it.
Mm.
Right, and I do believe that fear often is the driver of my anger.
Mm.
Right, fear. I've heard it said this way, which is, resentment is when I didn't get my way in the past. That anger is me not getting my way in the present. And fear is me worried that I'm not going to get my way in the future.
Mm.
Right. And so but the layers of resentment, anger, and fear are guarding my life in ways that really don't allow me to connect with the moment and the people that are in my life, because by and large, I'm just constantly worried about the way that I'm not getting what I want.
Yeah.
So I relate more with you, Louis, which is like, I think that anger and fear and resentment are more underlying than my freedom around sadness. Like I had this one of the most beautiful letters I've ever received in my life. I got from my daughter on my birthday this year. She wrote her present to me was a letter that broke me in half. And it broke me in half because she was reflecting back to me the father that I'm really in. I talk a lot about, like, my job as a dad is not to be the father that I think I should be. What I need to figure out how to do as a father in the world is show up as the father my kids need me to be.
Yeah.
And what she was reflecting back to me is that I'm being the father to her that I need to be being with her. And when you were talking earlier about the guilt and the shame driving so much of, Bryan knows, man, the guilt and the shame of the ways in which I feel like I'm inadequate.
I wasn't going to say anything, Tate. You needed to say that, but I was like,
but that's the way I live for the first half of my daughter's life and the first third of my son's, is living inside a guilt of fear about the ways that I wasn't showing up as the father that I know I needed to be, but I didn't know how. There's no one in front of me. My dad did the very best he could, and we have a great, great, great relationship now, but he wasn't the model of the father that I knew I needed to be in order to be the father that I think that my kids need me to be.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm not sure I answered your question, but I think that's kind of what's been banging around my head around that.
Yeah. And I learned something really interesting last week, which was boys are born more sensitive than girls. So when boys come out of the womb, they're actually more sensitive to the environment than girls. And that's been backed up by a whole load of studies about what's happened when there's been natural disasters, going as far back as Hiroshima. Boys are more sensitive to the environment than girls. So then we have to ask the question, what happens? Now, obviously, there's a bit of biology, as in, we have more testosterone typically than girls, but there's so much cultural overlay that just happens in a million micro moments every day, where we're essentially told, we're praised for being tough and aggressive. So in other words, anger and aggression are really typically okay for boys to express. Obviously not in school, but generally we want them to be tough and we want them to play sports. But fear and sadness, not so much.
No.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Louis, about something, this term divine masculine that you talk about also in your work. I think the word masculine, there's a lot of cultural charge around that. Divine masculine, I think there's a lot of, especially, in the, I've run for many years in the California spiritual community, and oh my God, the divine feminine, divine masculine, people can just take those terms and just create silly caricatures out of them.
Yeah.
Like the divine feminine, a lot of women wear these goddess wings and
Yeah.
sparkly glitter on their face, and that's fine. I mean, there's a whole lot we could say about what that is and what they're attempting to embody. I don't mean to be critical of that, but I do think it gets reduced into these. It can get reduced into these silly kind of caricatures of something.
Yeah.
We're exploring in this conversation, I think, what does it really mean to be a mature adult man, right? Through the lens of fatherhood.
Yeah.
Why is divine masculine? Why is that a term that you work with or you talk about? What does that mean to you?
Well, I think what I've noticed, and it may be different in the UK to the States and in other places, but we have a lot of men's work happening and we have a lot of women's work happening. And there seems to be quite an ease with which in the women's work, the concept of divine feminine gets articulated. And, the qualities of receptivity and softness and gentleness often is all of that kind of stuff. But I see so many people sharing about men's needs and men's mental health and saying, this is what we need for men, but they find it really difficult, I've noticed, to actually positively and concretely define what a positive version of masculinity is. And I think I know roughly why that is, because it feels like we're treading on some kind of dodgy territory when we do that as men, because the whole field of masculinity has, there's been just a huge amount of shame about men, toxic masculinity, the Me Too movement. And I have like a particular relationship to this because one of my best friends took his own life. It was literally the week before my daughter was born. So there was a kind of weird kind of something going on in the timing, one person leaves and another spirit enters. But he had, before he took his own life, started posting some stuff online where he was talking about how ashamed he felt to be as a man. And this was in the context of the Me Too movement and a lot of women, there's so much good stuff about that. A lot of women like sharing their experiences with men, bad experiences, abusive experiences. But I just always felt that he'd really internalized that into his own vulnerability and just massively internalized this sense of shame about being a man. So my main point is I think it's really important that we need to positively define and protect what it might mean to be as you say, a mature and wise and divine masculine person in the world. And I'm aware as I'm doing this, I'm going around the houses without actually wanting to give concrete words to what it might be. But I think, and it's interesting but I think some of the things we've mentioned today, like being a protector, I think that's just inherent in it. And often, because I'm really into Harry Potter with my daughter at the moment, she's like so deep into it. So we're in book 6. And it's a big old, it's like an epic adventure just reading it. But Albus Dumbledore, his character, I feel, is a great example of the divine masculine. He's obviously a wizard, so that's a good starting point. So he's actually something. He knows how to do some cool magic.
He's connected to the unseen realms, right?
Exactly.
He's listening to something greater than his own ego.
Exactly. And what's beautiful in the book is Harry Potter his parents obviously die when he's young, and so Dumbledore becomes his father figure. So Dumbledore represents, I think, what it means to embody the father archetype if you don't have your own children. And there's some beautiful moments in the story where Dumbledore, who's always perfectly poised and balanced and calm no matter what happens, but there's one moment with Harry in the recent book we've been reading where Harry does something and he just feels this deep sense of pride, and there's tears just trickling down his eyes, which I just thought is such a beautiful moment. But I think he embodies, a lot of qualities of balance and protection, connecting something deeper, having a bigger vision, holding a really strong moral direction.
And he's nurturing. I think this is one aspect of masculinity that gets overlooked, or it gets thrown over into the feminine category. If you're nurturing and loving and gentle, those are feminine traits. And I think that's selling masculinity short. Masculinity can also, and I think, again, full range, healthy masculinity is fucking completely loving and nurturing and honoring. I mean, some of the most healing moments in my adult life are when an older man looks at me and says, "Man, you're crushing it in life." I had my therapist, who's now my mentor, is 73 years old. He wrote books on men's work books back in the 70s, and worked with Robert Bly and the author of Iron John. And I remember he got my book when I started work with him, and he read it, and he reflected back to me. It was like, "Bryan, I am really impressed. You've written something that I wish I would have read, 40 years ago." Hearing those words from a man 23 years my senior, my own dad hasn't read my fucking books, or I think he has, but he only has critique. He doesn't have praise.
Can I tell you, Bryan, this is honestly a true story, but when I'd written my book, and I think I sent it, I can't remember if it was published or if it was just a draft, and I sent it to my mum and my dad. Okay. And my mum said, "Oh, amazing, well done, blah, blah, blah." And my dad sent me a text message. I remember I was actually on holiday, and I got this text message, and I was lying on the beach. It was like, "Son, I've just noticed that there's a mistake on page 53.
Of course.
So straight to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that's, when I think of these terms like divine masculine, divine feminine, and I like that we're making it just very practical. It's not a mystical thing. I think they're just maps. I think our work as men is to bring more range back into what masculinity, what it means to be masculine. Right. And so I love, in fact, I had a woman ask me who is a parent of a 14-year-old boy. She's like, what books could I have my 14-year-old son read that would help him become a good man? And I remember thinking, well, I don't really specialize in writing books for 14-year-olds. It's not really something I study. I wouldn't have them read nonfiction. I definitely would not have him read my book, Choose Her Every Day or Leave Her, or even my first book, Tell the Truth, Let the Peace Fall Where It May. Like those aren't for 14-year-old kids. 14-year-old kids need stories, fantasy. They need adventure. They're in a different mindset. And I thought of Harry Potter, the Harry Potter series, because I thought there's so much representation of all these different archetypes of maleness, you could say.
Yeah.
From playfulness to nurturing to courageous, from warrior, lover. I mean, all the archetypes are present.
Yeah. Louis, one of the things that I'm thinking about, we not so long ago, Bryan and I kind of changed the focus of our podcast. We used to be called Men This Way.
Yeah, I
and
noticed.
when we've transitioned into this podcast name of Bridging Connections, right? Because we know that there's things that are in the gap that may not being discussed, that if we were to discuss, it could bridge some connections between men and women, between mothers and fathers, between masculine and feminine, between, all kinds of things. And as I think about your book, How the World is Making Our Children Mad, what connections do you see that need to be bridged between mother and father, between men and women, in order for there to be the grounding that the kids need to be able to go face a world that is in and of itself mad? What connections do we need to bridge in that space?
Well, I first of all love the fact that you've made that shift, because I've been thinking for a while actually that we've had, I don't know how long, I mean, it's probably quite a long time, but certainly it's got more intense recently. We've got such a polarization between men and women specifically in terms of the spaces that are held. And I think those spaces have been important and necessary. But I have been thinking for a while, where are the spaces where we are bridging the connections and bringing men and women together to do the healing that we need to do together? So I just want to salute you for that decision. I think it's so important.
That's affirming.
Yeah. And in terms of what connections do they need to make? Gosh, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is just to be able and supported. Sometimes I think they need to be supported to just see each other and to witness each other in what you would call their full range, because we have these men's groups where men can be, it's amazing, and the work that you guys do, they can be witnessed in their full range of masculinity. But perhaps we need spaces where men can be witnessed by women and women can be witnessed by men. Yeah, I'm not sure what else to add to that. It's a good question, but what are your thoughts?
Well, I guess I think about, gosh, Bryan, I'm terrible with names. We had an author. He wrote a book called The Boy Crisis, and one of the things that he talked about is how boys are underperforming in something like 70 different categories as it relates not just to other girls, but boys from prior generations. And he posited that the primary reason that boys are suffering in today's society is the absent father.
Yeah.
Not just physically, but being absent in their full presence. And then he goes on and corrects himself later to say, actually, that's not the number one reason. The number one reason is actually essentially the lack of connection between the mother and the father. Because when the mother and the father are not connected at the levels that they need to be connected, what tends to happen is the mother tends to be the primary force and source and support for the children, not just boys, but the children in their life. And fathers tend to take a back seat. They yield to whatever needs to be done, or to what the mother is doing. And so in a world of bridging connections, I guess one of the things I think about that has to happen to help children deal with the mad world is for mothers and fathers. And what we now know to be true is the vast majority of kids today are being born into homes where mothers and fathers are not married together. And I'm not making a judgment about that, but that there is this separation that's happening. And if mothers and fathers are not, they don't have to be married, but at a minimum, if they're not connected, and even if you're divorced, if you're separated, you still have a lifelong relationship to forever now have, because you brought a child into the world, and they're going to be having a wedding one day, and that child is going to want both parents fully present and there and available. So it just strikes me, in a world of bridging connections, that one of the greatest gifts that we can be thinking about is how can we as mothers and fathers be connected so that we can be protecting and preparing and being present for our kids to deal with the world that they're facing. And I think about, that other Krishnamurti quote, which is, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." Mm-hmm. One of the indicators to me of a sick society is the ways in which there is a breakdown in relationships. If 50% of marriages are ending in divorce, my guess is at least 50% of the people that are in marriages are not thriving inside of it. So in order to create the foundation for the kids that we need to be able to support them to face their world, is that we as partners need to do a better job of staying connected.
Yeah. And just to add one thing to that. So what follows from connection is often congruence. And for a child to experience congruence from their parents is so psychologically important. And I'll give you a specific example. So the charity that I used to run, I stepped back from it recently, but it's called A Part of Me. And we developed a load of interventions to help young people who are going through trauma and grief. And for one service we were developing, I interviewed a girl she's now a CEO of a company, but she grew up in Baghdad when bombs were raining down. It was during the civil war with Iran. And
Wow.
She told me this amazing thing, which has always stuck with me. And she said, it wasn't the fact that the bombs were falling down and there was all this horror going on outside our house that actually turned this into a traumatic experience for me, but it was the fact that my parents kept telling me that everything was okay, and I knew that it wasn't.
Wow.
And so she made me really understand at a deeper level that congruence is so important. And I think you only get true congruence if both parents are connected and roughly on the same page about things.
Yeah,
Well,
and congruent with the reality, not telling kids don't look over there, right? Like that they're not only congruent with one another, but they're congruent with the reality that they're facing. And if there's if bombs are dropping, right, to really acknowledge that there are bombs that are dropping, and not to and Baghdad is literally, but in our lives on a regular basis, there are constantly bombs that are dropping in and around us.
Well, man, that so lands for me too. Just, I grew up in a home where there was some just profound dysfunction happening, and no one was willing to talk about it. We didn't talk about it. And what did I do as an adult? I built my success. I built my whole business, everything off of talking about the things that no one's talking about. Almost, it started off not as a big fuck you to the world, but just as a like, well, if I can't talk about this at home, I'm definitely talking about it publicly on my blog to the world. And at one point there was a reckoning where someone in my home read something that I had written about what we didn't talk about when I was there, and it caused a massive rift for a moment. I had I chose to repair that in a way, but that really lands for me. That's something that hurt me deeply, that we didn't talk about, that certain things that were going on weren't spoken about, that created an anger, a resentment, a seething kind of rage.
What's important to say about that as well is typically a child who's 4 years old doesn't have a sense of what's normal and what's not. So if they're experiencing a painful environment and they're experiencing some suffering internally, they typically will develop a story that it's something to do with them, that it's their fault. And that's why the congruence and finding a way that is manageable for a child to name the reality is so important, because it just stops them from blaming themselves.
That's powerful.
Tate, how do we conclude this with Louis?
Yeah, look, I think, in a world of, we're talking about bridging connections, I think that there's one other question that I think may help land the plane, which is, I know that in your book you talk about, love, the capital L is the key to raising children in a mad world. So I think just in practical terms, what does love look like in action for the parents that are listening? How, what we do daily matters more than what we do every once in a while. So what are the daily acts of love that you think that our listeners could take away and really lean in ways that would make a difference for them?
Yeah, well, I think you could probably substitute love for presence, and it would answer quite a lot, because In my experience, I feel that I'm doing a good job as a dad when I'm just present with my daughter, and I feel love coming through me when I'm present with my daughter. And so if I can try and infuse my moments with my daughter with intentionality and with presence, whatever we're doing, you know, picking her up from school, reading Harry Potter, I've definitely noticed there's nights where I'm reading it and I am really not wanting to be reading it because I'm so tired. And she's like,
"Oh, thank you for saying that."
yeah. And there's mornings where she comes into my bed, and this has actually become a routine. It's quite funny, but she literally comes in, throws the Harry Potter book in my bed, gets in and says, "Read, Daddy." And I'm like, "Oh, just give me 2 more minutes, please."
Yeah.
So obviously we
That's
can't
sweet.
be present all the time.
Yeah.
But I do think it's also easy to be so distracted as a parent in the 21st century.
Yes.
We haven't really talked about digital technology much, but it just is obvious to say that it's, you know, it's really hijacking our attention. But one of the most profound ways in which that has a negative impact is not being present with our kids. So I think most people have a sense of that, but it's really hard to overcome because the technology is so addictive. So we really need to have quite strong I found I need quite strong boundaries for myself with technology so that I can be more present with my daughter.
It's actually the every year when we work with men in our year-long program, we have men identify a vision that they have for the year that they want to live into. And then we have them identify what's one area of your life that you know you have to elevate in order for this vision to come to reality. And the number one area that I'm working on this year is my presence. Like that, I know that if I'm going to step into the year in a way that I come out on the other side feeling like I've elevated my life, that the area of my life that I've got to make sure is front and center is my presence. So that really, really resonates with me.
Yeah.
Really resonates. So thank you, Louis. Thank you.
Beautiful.
Well, Louis, thank you. Your book is called How the World is Making Our Children Mad and What to Do About It. I'll hold it up here for our YouTube audience. Where can people learn more about what you're up to, Louis, and get your book and connect with you?
Yeah, so I have a website, which is my name, louisweinstock.com, and I'm on LinkedIn, and I have a Substack now, actually, which I've been doing the last 2 months, which I'm really enjoying because it's just such a great platform to write on, and I'm, you know, getting really good feedback. So if people want to go over, pardon me, it's called The Heart of Being Human, Louis Weinstock, Substack.
Okay, great. We'll put all those links in the show notes. Louis, it's really great to connect with you again, man. And man, thank you for coming on Bridging Connections.
Thank you for having me, guys. It's been a great convo.
Thanks, Louis.